Hi, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Chris Monsieur. I'm a faculty member in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and together with Professor Jenny Liu in Urban Studies and Regional Planning, we co-host this seminar today. Our Friday Transportation Seminars are a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the Portland State University campus, but due to the pandemic, are being held remotely. It's important to recognize that Portland State University is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watala bands of the Chinook, and Tualatin, Kailapua, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities, honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Maura Kelly present on retention of diverse construction workforce. As a public sociologist, Maura researches inequalities in the construction trades and advocates to increase opportunities for women and people of color in the trades. Her evaluation research with Dr. Lindsay Wilkinson has assessed a variety of programs intended to increase the recruitment and retention of the diverse workers in the trades, including Highway Construction Workforce Development Program, Green Dot for the Trades, Oregon Tradeswomen, and Constructing Hope pre-apprenticeship programs, Mentorship Matters, and the City of Seattle Acceptable Work Sites. Before jumping into the seminar, I'd like to show you the upcoming webinars, which are shown here on this slide for the next 4 weeks. So plan ahead and sign up for these upcoming presentations. Just a quick reminder or an overview, we're using the Zoom webinar platform, and you can expect the presentation to be 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. You want to enter your questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom webinar control panel, and then we will ask the speaker your questions. And if we run out of time, we do forward the questions to the speaker so that they can answer some of those by email. We'll be recording today's webinar, and it'll be available on the website later today, along with the presentation slides. With that, we're ready to begin our presentation for today.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Maura Kelly. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So my team at Portland State has been researching the construction trades for about 10 years, and we primarily evaluate programs implemented by public agencies designed to improve the recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce. And you heard a little bit about some of those programs in my intro. The research I'm going to talk about today was funded by the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries, and TREC. So the topic of workforce retention is maybe more important for the construction industry than ever. Even prior to COVID, low retention represented huge losses in investments in those workers, and the industry was already experiencing worker shortages. The pandemic has, of course, worsened this trend across many industries. To move forward, we're going to need to be clear about what's impacting the construction workforce pipeline and what the industry can do about it. My team's research primarily focuses on apprentices in the construction trades. Apprenticeships are 3 to 5 year programs that include both classroom instruction as well as on-the-job training. After someone completes an apprenticeship, they become a journey person. They may then go on to supervisory positions or leadership positions in the industry. Next slide. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about who the apprentices in Oregon are. So this figure shows some change over time in terms of tracking our efforts to diversify the construction workforce. And so as you can see here, there's a steady but slow increase in the number of apprentices completing an apprenticeship who are women and people of color. So this overall trend includes both factors related to recruitment and retention. Next slide. So here we see some data on recruitment. So as you can see, this is a big part of the challenges with diversifying the trades, that the majority of new apprentices are still white men. And this is because most new apprentices enter into apprenticeship through referrals. Some of the apprenticeship coordinators that I'd interviewed for another study talked about 95% of people come into apprenticeship because they know someone else that was in the trades. In the trades, they call this the FBI, the father's brother's in-law. And that's sort of the pathway into the trades for many people. For people of color whose communities have been historically excluded from the trades, as well as women who have been discouraged from entering the trades, both because of societal expectations for what kinds of jobs are appropriate for women, as well as the correct perception of sexism in the trades, we see challenges recruiting women as well. Next slide. The other piece of it is the retention issue. So one piece to point out is that overall retention in apprenticeship is not high. Over 40% of white male apprentices who start an apprenticeship won't finish. And there's lots of reasons for that. Construction is not for everybody, so we would expect some amount of attrition out of these programs. But what is really concerning is the disparities across the racial ethnic groups. And we see evidence of the harassment and discrimination in terms of how that plays out in people's ability to complete their apprenticeship. Next slide. So oftentimes there's sort of a myth in the construction industry that the reason people leave is that it's not for them. And what many people mean by that is that they assume workers don't want to be at the job site at 6 a.m. They don't want to work in the rain or the heat, that the job is too physically demanding. But that, in my research, turns out to not be one of the major reasons that people leave the trades. In my 10 years of doing research, I talked to one person who left the trades because they didn't like the outdoor nature of the work. The real reasons that people tend to leave the trades is because they are made to feel as if the trades are not for them. And so these here are some of the main challenges that people face, and I'm going to go through each of those. Next slide. So apprentices who have participated in our research studies have consistently described being harassed on the job site based on their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, and even just being an apprentice. Many apprentices experience job sites as hostile work environments. As shown in some of the examples here, apprentices from all race and gender groups are harassed on construction job sites, but our research finds that women and people of color are more likely than white men to experience harassment and more likely to report the most extreme examples of harassment. This kind of sexism, racism, and other forms of job site harassment are enough to push some people out of the trades. But for those who persist, those racist and sexist attitudes impact their ability to access personal relationships and the professional networks that will ensure that those folks receive high quality training on the job, as well as stay consistently employed, which is critical for completing an apprenticeship. We also know that job site harassment impacts not only retention, but also productivity. When workers are being harassed or ignored, they're not being their most productive. It also impacts safety. Harassment on the job makes some apprentices fear for their physical safety. And I've also heard of job site accidents that occurred as a direct result of harassment and discrimination against women and people of color. Next slide. A common challenge for apprentices is not having access to training or mentoring on the job site, meaning someone to teach them the skills of their trade. And this is particularly problematic because the model of apprenticeship is that the more senior workers are providing training to the apprentices. And across our studies, women and people of color are consistently more likely to report being unfairly assigned tasks not related to the skills of their trade, like flagging or cleaning up the job site. And when you have the more skilled tradespeople doing the more basic tasks, this also impacts the overall productivity on a job site. So this discrimination can be due to explicit sexist and racist attitudes of supervisors, but it can also be due to white male senior workers' unconscious preference for white male apprentices to do those more skilled tasks and receive that higher quality mentoring. Next slide. So in the current moment, a lack of access to work is not one of the major issues impacting many apprentices given the labor shortage, but construction is cyclical. This has been a major problem in the past, and it will almost certainly be a problem in the future. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about it here. So in our 2020 analysis of labor and industries data, we found that women and Black men apprentices accrued on the job hours more slowly than white men, meaning they were given less access to work. Those who accrue on the job hours more slowly are less likely to complete their apprenticeship. Being out of work for extended periods of time is one of the main challenges that pushes people out of the trades. It is, these financial challenges, especially being unemployed, is a major factor that leads folks to leave the trades. So our research suggests that women apprentices and apprentices of color accumulate on the job hours more slowly because of informal practices in which primarily white male senior workers favor white male apprentices. For example, moving a favored white male apprentice onto the next job where women and people of color are sent onto the out of work list. Again, this can be due to supervisors' sexist and racist attitudes, or it could be due to an unconscious preference for people with shared identities. Next slide. In addition to the specific challenges of being out of work too much, apprentices have financial challenges related to work expenses. Apprentices are generally required to provide their own ready items, so tools, clothing, and PPE. I will say one small benefit of the pandemic is that I now no longer have to say what PPE is because we all now know. But this can be a significant startup cost at the beginning of apprenticeship, and other work expenses like childcare can persist throughout an apprenticeship. Some apprentices also have larger financial challenges like losing transportation or housing that may push them out of the trades. Next slide. Some of the apprentices that we spoke to noted that the main reason they left their apprenticeship is because of the long distance they had to travel for work. And I do want to note that much of our research focuses on the highway trades. And so it may be that the challenge of out-of-town work may be more common among those working on highway and bridge projects compared to other kinds of construction projects, but this can be an issue throughout the industry. Apprentices often believed, probably accurately, that they could not ask for a rotation out of jobs that were too far from home to be sustainable. And they felt that their only choice was to leave their apprenticeship. So for some, the main issue was the cost of travel, gas and wear and tear on a vehicle. But for others, it was the time away from home. And, parenting can increase many of the challenges that I've described so far, but parenting makes traveling significant distances for work just not feasible for some apprentices who are parents. And given that women are disproportionately responsible for caring for children in our culture, these issues disproportionately impact women apprentices. I think of the example shown here of a woman who loved working in the trades, wanted to make it her career, but she was away from home from 3:30 in the morning until 7 at night, and she didn't see her children during the week. And that was just not a sustainable job for that family. And so that's why she left the trades. All right, so we have some big problems here. So let's get to what we can do about it. Next slide. So one of the strands of our research is looking at the Highway Construction Workforce Development Program. So this is funded by the Department of Transportation and Bureau of Labor and Industry. And there's multiple parts to the program. I'm going to talk about the three that we've evaluated, which is pre-apprenticeship, supportive services, and respectful workplace initiatives. Next slide, please. So I know this talk is primarily about retention, but I want to touch on recruitment briefly. That, these are interrelated factors. And one of the things that's going to help retention is by building a critical mass of women and people of color. We've heard that it's very difficult to be the only person of your gender or your race on a job site. And so we need to address that through recruitment of diverse apprentices. So in the top figure here, you see 132 white women who were apprentices entered into apprenticeship through the pathway of pre-apprenticeship. And that makes up about 13% of white women apprentices in the study period. So apprenticeships are designed to provide an alternative pathway into the trades from those who are excluded from that FBI network, fathers, brothers, in-laws. And you can see here that the scope is fairly small, but we see that this is a really effective tool for diversifying the construction workforce, especially for women. And this could certainly make a much bigger impact if we were able to scale it up to serve more pre-apprentices across the state. Next slide. So this shows the overall impact of receiving services from our program. This is the slide our funders love to see. So you see that the blue bars are higher than the green bars, meaning that people that receive these services are more likely to complete their apprenticeship than the people that don't receive the services. There's some exceptions with some groups of women of color. This is due to the extremely small number of people in those groups, and so those are not statistically significant. But overall, we see that the program has a positive impact across race and gender groups. Next slide. And this one shows first the overall impact. So people receiving any services were 16% more likely to complete their apprenticeship. And we also see some variation in how different kinds of support help people. So it was really interesting to us that the non-financial services had the biggest impact on completion. So non-financial services included things like a budget class and one-on-one mentorship provided through the program. There's also partner organizations that provide that non-financial support, like Oregon Tradeswomen hosts various events for women in the trades. And there's other dimensions of this non-financial support as well. But it was interesting to us that that helped more than some of these other pieces of the program. But you do also see that childcare has a positive impact on people's ability to complete. So these are childcare subsidies provided by the program that are intended to help parents be able to overcome that challenge of finding childcare. We also see ready items. So this is the tools, clothing, and PPE has an impact on completion. One of the interesting things about this is that apprentices tend to get those ready items at the very beginning or perhaps even before their first day on the job site. So a staff person from the program will take them out and buy them, the boots, the basic tools that they'll need to be ready on day one. And so the reason that this is so helpful 3 to 5, years out when when folks are completing, they might not even have those boots anymore. But my sense is that it's partially alleviating that initial burden, financial burden of getting into the trades to provide some of that basic gear. But then also it provides an opportunity to connect with the program, that when you meet with the staff person, you get her phone number and she's available for apprentices to text when problems come up. And so it's a really important way to bring people in to get access to the program by providing something that they know they need, boots, and then being able to offer something that they maybe didn't know that they needed, which is some of that non-financial support. And then gas and travel had the smallest impact overall on completion. So part of our thought here is that, that this program, helps meet some very specific needs of apprentices, but there may also be something going on in terms of the idea of if an industry invests in you, then people are going to feel more connected to it down the line. That we saw in one study that people who had received services were more likely to be in the trades 2 years after apprenticeship compared to people that didn't receive services. So that we see these longer term effects than what we would have originally expected. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about pre-apprenticeship and recruitment, as well as some supportive services to promote retention. But ultimately, if we want to have a strong pipeline of diverse construction workers, we have to address job site culture. So I was part of this group last summer that evaluated several different models of trainings that were intended to create respectful workplaces or address job site harassment. And we came up with a couple of recommendations. Next slide, please. So the programs that the committee recommended were Green Dot and Rise Up. So both of these involve worker and manager trainings ideally for all workers on a job site. Rise Up also provides some complementary kinds of interventions. So things like looking at a construction firm's policies and practices, looking at disciplinary issues, and providing sort of a wider, more comprehensive approach to dealing with job site harassment. So between these two, I think both are excellent programs. I tend to favor the Rise Up program because it offers multiple different tools. And also there's a lot of flexibility that contractors can decide which of the tools are going to be most helpful on their specific job sites. Next slide. Both Green Dot and Rise Up include a component of bystander intervention. So this was something that was developed outside of the trades. And the idea here is that when folks see harassment, discrimination, violence happening, we want them to do something, to intervene. And so for the most part, most people think of an intervention as being direct, right? So getting in the middle of it, telling somebody to stop doing something along those lines. One of the main goals of bystander intervention training is to offer workers more tools on different ways to intervene. So you might distract. If it's a lunchtime conversation, you could change the subject. You could delegate. You can refer the issue to someone else, a supervisor, perhaps, to deal with. You can delay and check in with the person experiencing harassment and discrimination later and offer your support, for example, if they wanted to report what they had experienced. Document, we haven't seen too much in the application in the trades, but that's part of the Hollaback model. Next slide. So I was a part of the group that implemented the pilot of Green Dot for the trades on a job site here in Oregon. So my team did 4 waves of surveys, the first one prior to the intervention, and then 3 more waves of data collection as the project was rolled out. And the goal here, or the most important outcomes for us were to see, does the training increase people's ability to intervene? Are they doing something when they see harassment happening on the job site? And the second is to reduce harassing behaviors. So looking at people's ability to intervene from wave 1 before the program was implemented to the subsequent waves, we do see workers were more likely to intervene and do something when they saw something happening on the job site. So this was a really positive outcome of the study. Next slide. Here we're looking at instances of harassing behavior. So first thing to note that you see a big jump between wave 1 and wave 2, couple reasons for that. One is that wave 1 was at the beginning of the project where there were very few workers on site, and harassment tends to be lower on smaller job sites. The second piece is that when you implement trainings, you often expect to see an initial increase in reports of harassing behavior, not because harassment is going up, but because people are learning to recognize it. So that jump between wave 1 and wave 2 is expected. We did see a slight decrease in the harassing behaviors over the waves of the project. So this, on the one hand, was a success in that going into this, we didn't know if you could change job site culture through this kind of intervention. So it's a really exciting finding that this is possible. This is a tool that can definitely work to help address this problem. The not so good news is that at the end, workers were still seeing almost 7 instances of harassment a month, which is a lot of harassment. So I think there were certainly some lessons learned from this initial project that have been used in refining the Green Dot for the Trades program. It has been updated and adapted in subsequent implementations. And also there's quite a bit to learn about sort of broader efforts at culture change in terms of what works, how can we get the most out of these programs that we're implementing. All right, next slide. So I want to talk just a little bit about the best practices for culture change based on what I've seen in terms of my role as an evaluator on some different construction projects in Oregon and also up in Washington. So first, not surprisingly, it starts at the top. These initiatives won't work unless the leadership of the project owners and contractors can communicate and demonstrate that culture change is a priority. And one of the ways they can demonstrate this is by implementing one or more initiatives to address culture, and then also dealing with issues when they do arise. So Green Dot for the Trades, Rise Up are 2 models. There's a lot of different ways that these issues can be addressed. The next is to revisit policies and processes related to reporting and discipline. So one of the unique aspects of the trades is there's a real culture of non-reporting. And so that's a real challenge for folks that are wanting to do something about harassment on job sites. So clearly there need to be mechanisms for formal reporting, but also it's critical to think about informal reporting. So this might look like somebody reporting something to a supervisor who then has a conversation with a worker rather than putting something down in writing. Also, some of these initiatives have attempted to do confidential or anonymous reporting through, for example, a hotline to provide workers that additional layer of protection to avoid any potential retaliation for reporting harassment they've experienced. I think that one of the challenges here is ensuring that frontline supervisors are reporting these instances up the chain when they hear and see about it. And another piece here is clarifying disciplinary processes with realistic consequences. So in the industry, a lot of people are using the language of zero tolerance, which for me, I think has a connotation of sort of a one strike and you're out, like a drug use policy. When we're talking about job site harassment, it's not one strike and you're out, right? There's an education component here. There's different levels of disciplinary action, et cetera. So I think if folks mean zero tolerance in meaning the sense that any instance of harassment will be dealt with in some way, I think that makes sense. But I think it's also really important to be realistic about what kinds of disciplinary measures really make sense for the industry and for the problems that they're dealing with. Another piece of it is ensuring commitment all the way through an organization. Oftentimes when I talk to leaders of construction firms, they don't want harassment on their job sites. They wouldn't tolerate that kind of language and behavior in their front office where they work. But there's something that happens in the translation all the way down to the job site that it's really critical to communicate to those frontline supervisors that this is a priority and letting them know what their responsibilities are. It's also important to acknowledge that sometimes it is the frontline supervisors who are the problem. They are the one who are doing the harassment. And so there needs to be mechanisms to deal with what happens when people in supervisory or leadership positions are the ones that are causing problems on a job site. The next piece is to provide workers with tools to support change. Obviously, the change, the policy piece is one part of this. But as some of the findings from Green Dot and some of the other job site interventions that I've looked at, providing workers with some specific tools can be really helpful, because workers are going to see what's happening on the job site in a way that leaders in an organization are not always going to see. So that those tools could be a variety of different things. Some programs move more towards education about appropriate behavior, about sexist and racist language or microaggressions. Some programs focus on telling the stories of marginalized workers to create empathy. Some promote some more specific skills around communication or mentoring. There's also bystander skills that I've talked about. There's a little bit of a question here about, are we aiming to change the minds of our workers or just the behavior? And I leave that question open, but, to my mind, if we can get a handle on the behaviors that are happening on the job site, I think that's something I think that's an important goal, and perhaps something that's more realistic for construction firms to be able to achieve, rather than necessarily changing the belief systems of their workers. The next piece is providing visible and consistent messaging around culture change. So we know sort of across lots of contexts that one-time trainings generally don't work, that this needs to be something that happens at orientation, as well as ongoing communication as long as a worker is on that job site. The way that this is delivered in some of the programs I've observed is through something like monthly toolbox talks. So these toolbox talks happen on a regular basis in construction on a variety of topics. And certainly this respectful workplace bystander intervention information could be incorporated into those kinds of ongoing communications with workers. This has been, really one of the main challenges I've seen in implementing these, is how to prioritize the time to deliver these interventions. And it's a little bit of a challenge here, because it requires some upfront investment in terms of time and money in order to roll out these kinds of interventions. I would suggest that in the long term, this is going to save money in terms of addressing issues of retention, productivity, and safety. So in my view, it's worth the relatively small upfront investment in buying these, getting these trainings onto your job site, buying into these programs. And using some of workers' time on the job to learn some of these kinds of skills. I think of a time when I was doing data collection on a job site. I was there for the morning meeting to do the surveys. There's like 200 people on the job site. I got like a dozen undergrad research assistants with me with my clipboards. And so we're there listening to the morning meeting, and the leader on the job site spent 20 minutes talking about a safety issue that had occurred the day before. And it was not anything that was anyone's fault, and nobody got hurt. Some materials had fallen due to faulty material. But this person spent a good 20 minutes kind of debriefing on exactly what had happened and how they were going to prevent it going forward. And just to speak for myself, I got a very clear message that safety was a priority on that job site, that they were willing to take the 20 minutes of 200 people's time in order to talk about this specific event. And I just wondered, what would it look like if we could dedicate that same amount of time to talking about things related to respectful workplaces and job site culture? Oftentimes in construction, we hear these parallels between the changes that happened around safety to what changes might happen around job site culture. There's certainly some similarities, that there's sort of an initial cost, if you will, in terms of to do things safely. Sometimes that means you need to do them more slowly. But ultimately there was a recognition that this is what was needed for the industry. It was good for workers and it was good for the bottom line. And so I think that there's some clear arguments related to job site culture that are right along those lines. And I think it also provides a place for optimism that if the industry can make such a fundamental change around attitudes towards safety, then it should be possible for the industry to also make some fundamental change around job site culture. So the next piece here, addressing harassment when it happens with appropriate consequences. I talked a little bit about this already, but when there's a lack of follow through, it really undermines the message of the initiative, right? So if you're getting these job box talks that are sort of all about, here's how seriously we're taking harassment, here's what we want you to do. And then if harassment's reported and nothing happens, it really undermines the work of the initiative. It sometimes can be challenging to make consequences visible because of privacy issues around workers. But this is something that really has to come through in one way or another to show workers that the firm is taking harassment seriously and there are going to be consequences for people who violate those expectations. And my last piece, as a researcher, you might not be surprised that I'm suggesting that folks evaluate the impact of their initiative. One piece of this is that harassment and discrimination are not always visible to leaders. And sometimes folks in leadership positions can have somewhat skewed views of what's actually happening on the ground on their job site. I think it's important to evaluate because we want to know, first of all, if it's working. And second of all, if it's not working, we want to know what's wrong and what we can do to fix it. If we're going to make this investment of time and money into these kinds of programs, we want to make sure that it's happening the right way, it's achieving the goals that we want it to achieve. And if not, tweak it and make it better. All of the programs I've been talking about are relatively new. This is a new aspect of the construction industry's history in terms of really in this present moment, there's a particular emphasis and a willingness to start to put some real energy into these things. And so I'm really hoping that we can sort of take full advantage of that momentum and really make some change. So to sum up, we know it's going to be critical to recruit and retain a diverse construction workforce to meet the demand for workers in the industry. We know we have some tools that work, that these can be leveraged by public and private owners and contractors to improve retention. We know that providing financial and especially non-financial support to workers increases their chances of completing. We know that by intervening on job sites, we can begin to address job site culture and find ways to improve those programs so that we can bring those levels of harassment down further and faster. All right, thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, thanks, Maura, for that presentation. Just a couple of quick announcements for the students that are taking the course before we get into the questions. One, there are assignments due every week, so make sure that you're following along on the course calendar and submitting those assignments. And if you haven't watched the introductory Zoom recording that Professor Liu and I made, please do that. We've noticed a number of you haven't been submitting your assignments. And secondly, we will have like a 15-minute optional hangout for the students after this webinar to talk about the topic. And the Zoom link is posted in D2L, and I just chatted it here. So with that, let's get into some questions. So remember, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box, type in your question, and we will pose them to Dr. Kelly. So I'll go first. The first question is, so what percentage of the construction companies that initiated the implementation of programs like Green Dot and Rise Up in Oregon? The question says that I know many of the large construction companies in Portland Metro signed up for Safe from Hate Pledge, but they hire many subcontractors, so not sure about the effectiveness of the program.
Yeah, great questions. So I would say right now the percentage is small. I know of one active site that has Green Dot, and a handful that are doing Rise Up here in Oregon. And then the city of Seattle has 5 or 6 sites that they are rolling out a version of Rise Up that they call that's related to their acceptable work site policy. So as of right now, we're really kind of still in the pilot phase, that these programs are still being refined to be as effective as possible. And we're still doing evaluation to make sure that, this is gonna work as we scale up. Rise Up is being led by Oregon Tradeswomen, who is an affiliate of Anu up in Seattle, who originated the Rise Up program. So Oregon Tradeswomen is really taking the lead on coordinating efforts to implement Rise Up more broadly in the industry. And we do think that, while we're going sort of job site by job site, company by company, that this is going to be much more effective at scale, that when workers are getting the same or similar kind of messaging across job sites, that's where we're going to really start to see change start to happen. The other piece of this, I'm glad you mentioned the Safe from Hate pledge. And there's also a Safe from Hate Alliance, which I attend some of their general meetings. And so this is a really exciting initiative. So it's stakeholders, so contractors, as well as unions, apprenticeship programs, advocacy groups, all sorts of the key public owners are all in this group working within kind of those subgroups to try to address this issue. And then all of those subgroups come together for these general meetings. So yeah, there are some contractors that are really on board, really, wanting to be active participants in making this change. And that's really exciting piece of it. I will say the subcontractor question is really challenging. It's hard to say. There's a lot of sort of finger pointing from one to the other, right? So about sort of who's responsible for this. And so I think that there's certainly some challenges in making sure that these initiatives make it all the way down to the subs. But there's contract language that's signed here. So public agencies can require certain language of their primes, and those primes can make certain requirements of their subs. And so I definitely have seen resistance. So there was one job site where I was there to do surveys, and the goal is to survey everyone on the job site. And the foreman for the sub said, "My people don't have to do this." And I know there's nothing I can do as a researcher. So I think that it's partially about, the carrot, sort of bringing subs along and sort of making the argument about how this is going to benefit them and the industry. And then also the stick in terms of contract language, and that these are now not just optional add-ons. This is part of the scope of work, is to make sure that your workers are being trained with these kinds of skills. But it's not easy. So that's a great question.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. One question that's been posed is whether you are familiar with some similar research and efforts that is in STEM positions in construction, like women or BIPOC engineers in construction, and that there might be many overlaps in the challenges, but also some differences that would be helpful to raise awareness of. Just wondering whether you see any connections there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked with a great interdisciplinary team at PSU to look at the water sector workforce, which includes a lot of these kinds of folks, although the ones sort of specifically related to water management. And yeah, we absolutely found that there's a lot of the same kinds of issues. Because the higher education required in those kinds of jobs, there's some of pieces of this that are sort of tied back to inequalities in the sort of education pipeline. And that's a little bit different than sort of the apprenticeship model. But certainly a lot of these experiences of discrimination are prevalent in engineering, other STEM kind of fields, and truly across many of what of the occupations that have historically been white male dominated. We tend to find a lot of these same kinds of trends.
So a question on the job site culture harassment. Was there any investigation done to see if the general feeling of social safety after the program implementation, i.e., Sorry, the question moves around a little bit here. If the same one or two people are still making inappropriate comments, maybe after the program, people felt more supported by their coworkers, whereas before their support was uncertain due to silence.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think. I mean, what we were mostly focused on with the surveys is the frequency of harassing behaviors. So that was kind of one of our main measures. We also asked some kind of more general questions about people's perceptions of, is this program working? And sort of those kind of more attitudinal kind of perception type questions. And people did, many people did feel like these programs were making a difference on the job site. We didn't ask questions sort of exactly along the lines of what this person is asking, though.
Thank you. One of the attendees is wondering about whether you've seen work that is more supporting undocumented workers specifically.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I have not really delved into too much. My sense is that my work looks specifically at registered apprenticeship. I think if you were to look more broadly at the construction industry and sort of all of the different roles that would kind of fall, into that industry, there would be a lot more undocumented folks in kind of that broader population. But no, I haven't looked into that, and I'm not sure of any research. That would be whoever's asking. I got a topic for you to study.
So attendee said, I did an internship this summer. I was the only Latina woman in the engineering office and at the job sites. Within just 3 months of working, I saw so many points that you talked about. Even if there were many Latinx men on the job site, all I saw were white men in the meetings with the engineers and architect. What would be the best practice to address this problem?
Yeah, this pipeline problem is huge. And I think that, having white men, be the majority of folks that are in leadership positions, is a real challenge for folks that are thinking about, like, what's my role in this occupation, in this industry, like, how high can I go, and where there aren't those role models there. So I don't have a great answer for this one. I mean, I think this is really about identifying, sort of all across the pipeline. So the beginning end, sort of what I study, the pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship, I know less about sort of the rest of tradespeople's careers, what happens when they journey out and what happens in terms of leadership development and promotion. But certainly there's needed interventions there, because there are many talented journey level workers who are women and people of color who are passed over for leadership positions. So certainly there's an additional aspect or layer of inequality that happens even for those who are able to persist past the years I'm describing and make it to those higher levels, that certainly they're experiencing discrimination and promotion in the ways that many women and people of color do in lots of kinds of occupations.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question about whether you could give some more examples of the types of non-financial support that would positively affect retention that you talked about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this one is a little tricky to answer because it's sort of the most messy of the kinds of support that are provided through the program, right? Like you either got the boots or you didn't, right? You got the childcare subsidies or you didn't. But sort of what is social support, and also how accurately can we track it, is a really tough question. So one of the interesting things about the interviews that we did in 2020 was that we had sort of a spreadsheet. Okay, here's the individuals that receive different kinds of services, and so we went in, to the interviews and asked them questions about how did this help, this and that. And only a small number had that box checked for, non-financial support. But once we started talking to people, we started hearing about how, they met with the staff member to buy their boots, but then they had her phone number. And so then they texted her when a problem came up on a job site. And then she connected them with Oregon tradeswomen who got with the union to resolve the problem that they were addressing. And so it's, it's always a little bit messy about sort of where that non-financial support comes from. So part of it is the staff person of the program that we're evaluating, and the ways that she really goes above and beyond to support apprentices, beyond just sort of the tangible financial support that she's able to provide, that she's seen by many as a mentor, as a reliable person that you can go to if you have any challenges that come up. So I guess I should just say it's penny painter. The penny painter effect is sort of what we call it. And so she's made a huge impact on people's lives. And so some of it is, as I briefly mentioned, kind of more formal aspects. So like she'll do like a budget class. Well, she'll sit down with an apprentice and look at income and expenses and all of those sorts of things. And then there's also partner organizations that serve apprentices that report back to BOLI, sort of here's the number of people that came to our social hour or, other kinds of events. But as I said, this has been one of sort of the really tricky pieces to track in that, what is social support or non-financial support? And we don't, not everybody writes it down when they've provided that kind of support to somebody. But those are the sorts of things, that are kind of in that category. And the reason it's so important is because, particularly for women and people of color, there's questions that come up about things that happen on the job site. This thing happened to me, like, is that normal? Or should I do something about it? And to the degree that folks don't have anyone to turn to answer those kinds of questions, makes it really challenging to be successful in the trades. So having sort of that go-to person that can help you, potentially both with some of your financial challenges, right? So if you lose your housing, there's hardship funds that Penny can help you access. But also if you're having a problem on the job site, you can text Penny and she will either help you or put you in touch with someone who can help you. So it's really kind of a mix of all of those things that I think has made the program so successful.
Okay, a question that says, I feel like the bystander expectation of reporting harassment was to rise up and stop it directly can be intimidating. So I appreciate now the direction now seems to be to distract or divert and have a better network for reporting. Has the direct intervention proven to be unpopular? And is that why there is a shift in expectation?
Yeah, it's, on the Green Dot site, we saw people really using all of those different tools in different ways. And I think, oftentimes it was people in supervisory positions who were doing more of that direct intervention. Perhaps they were doing that, before the program. I mean, that's sort of their job, right? Is to intervene when they see people violating company policy at work. So certainly there is the direct intervention, intervening in the moment or intervening later, for disciplinary reasons. Clearly, there's a higher expectation that people in supervisory positions will take on that role, as opposed to people that are in more vulnerable positions like apprentices. So I think that part of sort of who uses which strategy depends on where they are in the hierarchy. So for folks that are either have marginalized identities or are newer workers, they're apprentices, that some of those other strategies they're more likely to use because it's safer, it's less risky, right? To delegate to somebody else, or to check in with another apprentice later, rather than try to be that person that kind of steps up in the moment.
Great. A lot of your responses just really highlighted the importance of having this kind of mixed methods research and just really digging down into the things that you don't see in a lot of the numbers, which is really, really great. But I do have a kind of quantitative question that is posed, whether the tracking of the apprentices, did that include data when apprentices turned down work, or when there was kind of more like, were some of the methods adjusted for attrition as well?
Yeah, I mean, what I hear from the industry is that apprentices rarely turn down work. That particularly when it's scarce, which is most of the time up until recently, that by turning down, I mean, they're strongly discouraged to turn down work by their apprenticeship program, and it can have negative implications for when they're going to get offered their next job. So I've not heard that apprentices turning down work is one of the major problems in the industry. I think that, I think in some of the examples that I gave in the presentation, for example, around driving long distances, I think there's, to the degree that people might want to leave those job sites, or maybe even turn down those jobs to begin with, has less to do with their willingness to work as opposed to the logistics of their being able to do those jobs. And transportation is sort of the example that tends to come to mind.
Okay, a question about any findings about which recruiting and retention options are the most cost effective, where the cost of time is included in the calculation?
Yeah, so on the recruitment side, the only mechanism that we have evaluated is pre-apprenticeship. So the other ways that apprenticeship programs attempt to recruit is through things like radio ads. There's a lot of going into schools. So both, apprenticeship programs, unions, and also individual contractors, that they like to go into the schools and talk to the kids. And so, from my view, I don't have exact numbers on this one, but, in my view, with pre-apprenticeship, you've got folks that need a job and they are ready to work in the 4 to 9, they're going to be ready to walk onto the job site in the 4 to 9 weeks, it takes them to go through their apprenticeship programs. Some of these other pieces that various stakeholders spend a fair amount of time and money on, I just sort of wonder, how many middle schoolers do you have to, put a hammer in their hand in order for them to then become apprentices, in 5 to 10 years. So while I think, going into the schools is a lot of fun, everybody likes the kids, and of course we want kids to know that the trades are a viable career path. We've, with the college first discourse, that we've really sort of lost track of what a great career the trades can be. But I would say with a finite amount of time and money, I would put my efforts towards the folks that are the closest to being ready to work, which is adults seeking jobs, seeking out these pre-apprenticeship programs. As far as on the retention side, what's interesting is that the majority of the cost is really the time you're paying the workers to do these trainings. That the programs themselves aren't particularly expensive, to have someone come in and do a training, or even do a train the trainer, so you have your own staff that are able to implement these programs. I mean, not expensive in the $1 million construction budget world. And so it's really about balancing the time piece of it. And so because working quickly and safely are really at the core of construction, that taking that time to slow down and spend some time talking about these things, I think is where the cost comes in. And again, it's really just kind of about balancing that against how might this ultimately, save the firm save money in the future in terms of, retention most directly, but also in terms of productivity and safety.
All right, so I think we have maybe time for one more question. I think there was a question about how do you see an apprentice tackling the front office being supportive of their program and training, but the foreman and the field staff aren't explaining and teaching or being supportive?
Yeah, and this is where, I mentioned in my earlier comments that does sort of seem to be the sticking point, that it's often sort of the higher ups, the leaders in an organization are on board, right? They're saying, yes, we want to make job site culture a priority. We don't want to be the kind of company where people leave because of racism. But that there's something about that message doesn't always make it down to the foreman and the field staff. And then the messages that they hear are about productivity, and keeping on schedule. And so I think, this is a larger structural question about, if leaders are really committed to doing this, that they need to ensure that that message does get all the way down. And, ultimately folks that are not going to be on board with this, if this is a required component of your job as a foreman is to address job site culture, and you are unwilling to do it, then I think a hard decision needs to be made by the company about if that's the right foreman for this job site, because it won't work, right? If the people who are in leadership positions on the ground are not supportive. I've seen this even in my evaluation research. They're set up a day and a time for me to come and do the surveys. I need 10 minutes of their time. And I've certainly encountered foremen that they don't want to do it, right? They don't want their workers to take 10 minutes out of the day to do the survey. And so for me, that raises questions about how willing they are to implement the other parts of the program, and also what the message that sends to workers, right? If I'm, the researcher is there, but they're not supposed to talk to her because they need to focus on their work. So I think that this really is part of making sure that that messaging comes all the way through the organization. And maybe there's a point here where a hard line needs to be taken, that where if folks are not on board for this change, then maybe they're not a good fit for the culture of that company.
Great. Thank you, Maura, for the presentation and answering the questions. One thing we miss about the in-person is the loud applause, but there are some virtual great jobs on the question and answer. So thank you. So this concludes the Friday seminar. For those that are registered, you'll get an email asking you to complete a brief survey. If you could take a few minutes to do that, that would be helpful. And if you're the students, that Zoom hangout that we'll hold for about 15 minutes, it's optional, but you could talk with your classmates and the professors about the seminar. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you all.
Thank you.